said, we're welcoming Jim Bradley. He's emeritus professor from Calvin University. Jim was, it's been a number of years now since Jim retired, but he was a co-editor of mathematics in the postmodern age. And he's also co-edited Mathematics Through the Eyes of Faith. So he's had a lot of experience thinking and years of thinking about math and its relationship to our faith. And if you haven't seen it, there's a fascinating chapter in the recent book, a 2016 book, Abraham's Dice, Chance and Providence in the monotheistic traditions. It was edited by Carl Gibbardson, and in there, Jim has a chapter on random numbers and God's nature. So a lot you can draw on if you're interested in going further. Today, we're going to be talking about the short piece that Jim wrote in the summer of 2024 in God and Nature called Game Theory and Theology. So please welcome, would you, with me, Jim, to our Diving Deeper discussions table. Jim, glad to have you here.
Thanks.
So let's get to know you just a little bit before we get into the article itself, and tell us a little bit about your journey. You're in Grand Rapids, I think, in
Correct.
retirement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But where did you start? Math in your life had a beginning somewhere. You were born?
I was born in Buffalo, New York, actually, within sight of the place where Lake Erie empties into the Niagara River.
Fascinating place.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, structurally. So what's your journey? There's two pieces of your journey I'd like to hear. You can relate them, your faith journey, and also what led you to this professorship, your academic journey.
Sure. Okay. Well, let me just give the academic journey first, then I'll back up and do the faith journey.
Okay.
So I grew up in a suburb of Buffalo. My dad was a civil engineer. My mom was a top science student in high school, didn't pursue that, but I grew up in a home that was open to science, that liked it and encouraged it. And so when I graduated from high school, I went to MIT and started out as an electrical engineering major.
Okay.
And I realized by the time I got into my junior year that the only thing I really liked about electrical engineering was the mathematics. So I switched to a math major and graduated with that degree. After I graduated, I joined the Peace Corps. And I spent 2 years in India teaching high school math and physics.
Wow.
And that was where I really discovered my calling. I found that I really, when I graduated from MIT, I did not know what I wanted to do with this math degree. Yeah. And I just found that I just really loved teaching. Yeah. And I had some very good students in India. Right. My greatest joy in all that was one of my students in India actually went on, and I taught math and physics. He went on and earned a PhD in physics from Berkeley.
All right.
This is not your usual vision of what the Peace Corps is like, preparing students who go on to graduate school at American universities. But nevertheless, that did happen. So I really enjoyed doing that work. So when I came back to the States, I enrolled in a graduate program in mathematics and earned a PhD at the University of Rochester, which is where I was living at the time. The math department at Rochester was very much a pure mathematics department. And I realized fairly early in my program that I really wanted to be an applied mathematician. So I ended up doing my dissertation under a professor in the Graduate School of Management at Rochester.
Okay.
He was an operations research specialist. The math department was a little skeptical of all this, but nevertheless, they did finally approve my dissertation and actually gave me the degree. So that was really my area, was operations research, particularly in game theory. So that's kind of my academic journey.
So you might say you're an interdisciplinary scholar, right? Just not pure math, it's actually applied. And so you've gone over on the business management side a bit?
Yeah, well, the thing that always has fascinated me, it boggles my mind every time I think of it, is how it is that somebody can sit down and write some scribbles on a sheet of paper, manipulate them according to certain formal rules, and predict things about happen in the natural world. I mean, how can this be? How can there be such a correspondence between the way the world works and the way our minds and our language work? It just amazes me. And I particularly was interested in decision-making situations, and again, modeling of those. So that's kind of the direction that I went.
So
So I guess
maybe,
math modeling was really my connection between the mathematics and the non-mathematical world. That's what always fascinated me the most.
right.
Mhm.
Which I think make a segue here right to your faith journey, because I'm really curious is how does your faith then interact with that journey, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
which ends at Calvin as your career, right? So
Correct,
you tell
correct.
us that.
Yeah. Well, I was brought up nominally Roman Catholic. My dad was, neither of my parents were believers, but my dad always took me to Mass on Sunday, I think primarily out of regard for his mother, who was a believer.
Hmm.
But I took it very seriously as a child. I was a faithful Catholic kid.
Hmm.
Um, but I fell away from it when I was in my teenage years. And by the time I got to MIT, I was your garden variety agnostic, atheist science students.
Hmm.
Um, and I really came back to the faith through contact with some missionaries I met in India. They really challenged me to read the Bible. And as a pre-Vatican II Catholic, of course, I'd never read the Bible. Um, and so they said, my intellectual integrity was at stake here. I mean, how can you say you don't believe this when you haven't even read the Bible? So
Right.
they really put it to me. So I did read it. And I guess all I can say is I just was won over by the person of Jesus. I can say I kind of fell in love with him, really. I
Yeah.
remember thinking at the time, before my conversion, I was saying, if I'd been there at the time, I would have gone to Jesus and said, "Can I be one of your disciples?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I didn't know what to do with that. Then someone explained to me how to accept Christ
Hmm.
and so forth. So that's
Hmm.
really where it began.
Yeah. Fascinating, Jim.
Mhm.
Fascinating story. So now you come back from India, I assume, and then somewhere Calvin comes into the picture.
Yeah. Well, since I was in Rochester, so I taught at a Christian college in the Rochester area, Roberts Wesleyan, for several years.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I taught also at another local college, or a Catholic college in that same area. But then I came to Calvin in 1986, and I've been there ever since.
All
And
right.
Calvin, of course, has an enormous emphasis on integration of faith and learning,
Hmm.
which I was very much interested in, and was really one of the main reasons I went to Calvin, or took that
Hmm.
job at Calvin.
Hmm.
So I had a chance to really kind of think through, with a lot of encouragement from the university,
Hmm.
to think through the question of the relationship with faith and mathematics.
Right. Right. Well, that's great. And then somewhere along in that line, you bumped into ASA. In,
Yeah, that was when I was at Roberts Wesleyan. That's where I first came in contact with it.
okay.
Um, but the interesting thing is when I was at Calvin and I began to get very involved in the Association of Christians in the Mathematical Sciences,
Hmm.
there really were not many places that people could publish things that related mathematics
Right.
and faith.
And faith.
And the ASA's publications were one of the places we could do that.
Yeah.
So that became really important to me, not just for myself, but for the others in the ACMS who we were trying to encourage to pursue scholarship.
That certainly has been one of the main mission features of ASA and over
Mhm.
the years, and
Mhm.
pretty glad to hear that story. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
super. So let's turn. I want to turn now to your article, and
yeah.
I was looking through it. Had a few things that I wanted to ask you about. Um, the article is going to introduce us to game theory, right?
Mhm. Right.
Right away, you might say, well, okay, that's a piece of applied mathematics. So maybe you could tell us, those of us who don't work in that field and might get it confused with something. What is game theory? What is this all about?
Sure. So game theory is mathematical models of conflict situations.
Okay.
Period. In a nutshell. That's it.
All
Uh,
right.
and it has applications. The most common applications have been in economics. A few years back, I read that over 50% of the dissertations done in economics in one particular year used game theory in one way or another.
Okay. Okay.
But it also is very important in sociology and political science. And it's even been widely used recently in biology.
That's right. Well, and that's where I was first introduced to it. John
Mhm,
Maynard Smith's evolutionary biology, dealing
mhm,
with species and definition of relationship in the environment and how species are fixed in a certain environment, and
mhm,
why that happens. Use game theory
mhm,
as an
yeah,
explanatory tool.
yeah,
Again, predicting, as you were saying
mhm,
earlier,
mhm,
just this powerful predictive tool. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So now we turn from that notion of the theory of it to the particulars of this article. So how did you come to this?
Okay, so back in about a dozen years or so ago, I managed a grant program for the Templeton Foundation
Mm,
under the title Randomness and Divine Providence.
hmm hmm
And so we had a lot of applicants. I think there were over 70 applicants for grants, and we
hmm
ended up choosing, I think, about 10. And one of
hmm
the 10 was Stephen Brams. And Stephen is a political scientist, but a game theoretician. And
hmm
he's very good. I mean, he's a very well-known political scientist. And excuse me, the outcome of his research, his work, was he wrote this book I'm about to show you here. Uh,
Okay.
as it's called Divine Games.
Oh,
And so
okay.
Steve um, applied game theory to an analysis of a large number of situations in the Old Testament,
Oh,
conflict situations.
yep.
And his basic concept was look at the idea of God as the optimal decision maker.
Oh, okay.
And so he went through and he developed used different types of games, different types of strategies to look at a lot of these different situations. Um, and so when he wrote this book, he after it was finally published by MIT Press and finally came out, he sent me a copy, which I very eagerly read. And one of the things I realized very quickly is that although I was fascinated by Steve's idea about using game theory to study theology or study particularly the Old Testament, Steve's interpretation or understanding of God's actions and activities were very different than my own.
Okay.
Um, he's from a Jewish background,
hmm
but he also is religiously he's a skeptic. And the subtitle of his book is Game Theory and the Undecidability of a Superior Being.
Ah,
So the book is really an argument for agnosticism.
yeah.
So I thought, well, I ought to do something with this, but I don't know
Right.
what to do. I was puzzled by it, particularly given where Steve was coming from.
Yeah.
And so I wrestled for a long time with this. What can I do? What can I? And
hmm
I really identified two ideas in game theory that I thought were helpful in understanding theology. One is the idea of God as the optimal decision maker. And I
hmm
really liked this because it focused not so much on God as the creator or God as the
hmm
sustainer of physical creation, but God as a person, as a decision maker that interacts with other decision makers. I thought that was a kind of a unique insight that was
hmm
worth exploring. Um,
hmm
the other idea that really struck me was that game theory makes a distinction between what's called a strategy and what's called a tactic.
hmm
Tact is what you do in a specific situation. A strategy is a much bigger picture plan of the whole way of doing things. And I thought, this distinction of thinking being at two different levels, I thought might be helpful in understanding some
hmm
things that might seem difficult to understand in terms of God's actions and as they're
Yeah.
recorded in Scripture.
Yeah.
So those are the two ideas. But I sort of puzzled. I don't know what to do with this. And then one day, I opened my email, and lo and behold, there was a link from ASA to the issue of God and nature.
hmm
So I
hmm
opened it and began to read it. I said, "This is the perfect fit for what I want to do.
Yeah.
I can write a shorter article
Right.
that I can just take these two ideas and kind of just explore them a little bit." I
Yep.
thought they were helpful. To see if I can, maybe somebody else might find them helpful too, and
hmm
put it together and send it off to ASA. And they said, "Well, yeah, okay.
Wonderful.
Looks like maybe it is helpful." So they
Yeah.
published
Yeah.
it. Mhm.
Well, we'll find out. I mean, there's a synergy has already brought it to this venue, right?
Mhm,
And you
mhm.
get
Yeah.
a wider hearing. I can imagine because as I've been thinking about this and reading, and you pushed me to read a bunch more because we didn't even talk about random numbers and that whole side of things in your
Mhm,
work. And I was thinking, well, there's a whole fruitful area here that could easily generate articles to perspectives or these deeper research articles, or
mhm,
maybe some other opinion pieces. Because I think
mhm,
your point here that you just made is one we might want to explore is the theological assumptions that one makes coming in. As you said, these that Steve Grant made,
mhm,
he comes to very different and frames things very differently than you frame them. So I
Absolutely.
think that
Mhm.
that perspective is really helpful and important.
Yeah. And
All right.
I see those Old Testament stories so differently than Steve does.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
come with just a very traditional
Yeah.
historical Christian perspective, same
Right.
thing that Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox people all believe.
Right.
Whereas Steve does not believe any of that, and
Yes.
so he sees God's actions just from a
Right.
totally different perspective.
Well, it's an interesting opportunity because there's a
Mhm.
whole class of folks that you can speak to in this way that you could
Mhm.
speak to in other ways. And
Mhm.
I love that title that he had for this here when you talked about what was it, Divine Games. Um,
Mhm.
Game theory somehow gives us lots of interesting. That's almost a movie title, and I'm thinking of A Beautiful Mind, right?
It
John
does sound like
Nash,
one, doesn't it? Mhm.
and there, it's just like this has been a very culturally fruitful area. So let's go into the article itself. Do you want to give
Mhm.
us just a brief sketch of what you've done here, the particulars of the article? You set it
Sure.
up with Nineveh.
Would it help for me to give an example of how this distinction between strategy and tactic works?
Sure, go
Okay,
ahead.
let me give an example. So some years ago, I was at a meeting of the Military Operations Research Society in Washington,
Hmm.
and one of the speakers was from the Pentagon strategist,
Hmm.
and he was talking about the first Gulf War.
Hmm.
And he told the story about a battle that was coming up and how they, as strategists, approached it. And they did the typical game theory kind of thing. They went through and listed all the different um, particular actions, so
Hmm.
tactics, that the
Hmm.
American side could have taken.
Right.
And then they put those down on one side of a sheet of paper. And all of the possible tactics that the
Yep.
Iraqis could have taken along the other side. So they got a matrix set up or a table. And they
Hmm.
went through and filled it in and say, if we do this and they do that, what's the consequence? And so forth. And they went through the whole, filled in this table, which took them some time to do. And then they analyzed it using game theory ideas, particularly idea being something
Hmm.
that is called a saddle point, which is how you identify what the optimal strategy is. It's the
Hmm.
one that gives you the best possible outcome, and the
Hmm.
other side can't possibly change their strategy and do anything better.
Right.
Um, so they identified that saddle point and decided that's the strategy that the Americans were going to pursue in this battle.
Hmm.
The battle began, and
Yeah.
they realized very quickly that the Iraqis had not chosen the best strategy that they could have chosen. In
Mm.
fact, of all the strategies they could have chosen, the one they chose was the second worst from their
Oh.
perspective.
Oh.
So the Americans immediately changed their tactics
Yes.
and went on to win a very decisive victory.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so there's the difference. So did the Americans change their mind? Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
changed their tactic, but didn't change their strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
The strategy was the whole table with
Right.
all of
Right.
the different options available to them and
Yeah.
all the different responses that the Iraqis could have made. So
Right.
that was the big picture. So they kept the same strategy. But
Hmm.
when they got into specifics, they changed their tactic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought the way that applies to theology, it seems to me, is that God thinks at both levels.
Hmm.
And when he deals with a particular situation, a particular individual, he has to choose a tactic. And he chooses the optimal tactic. But
Hmm.
behind that, there's a much bigger strategy.
Hmm.
And so the optimal decision in one situation might be different than in another, or with one person might be different than another.
Hmm.
And if a person changes their mind, for instance, a person who repents of sin, God's way of thinking about and dealing with that person will also change. Does
Hmm.
not mean that God changed his strategy
Hmm.
or his overall thinking about it, but he did change. In a sense, he changed his tactic.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a helpful insight.
That is really very helpful. And
Mm-hmm.
I just want to do an aside at the moment. This is
Mm-hmm.
so appropriate for the moment we're in. I mean, some of you, I haven't paid too much attention to the news this last week, but I suddenly caught my attention this morning and I was looking, and exactly this question is coming up between Israel and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to another thing because the United States is certainly mixed in there, as are others. So you've set this up in the article as a two-way matrix of decision
Mm-hmm.
makers. Can this theory be extended when you have three or more players? Is there
It's
a
really hard.
Okay,
It's kind of a
that's
three-body problem, right? If I can compare it to physics.
right. And it's this is the challenge. That's what I heard the reporters talking about, the interviewing.
Mhm.
And they were asking the questions: What are the Israelis going to do? What are the Iranians going to do? What are the Americans going to do? That was the three body problem they were dealing with.
Sure.
And of course, then they're also extending it to multiple others.
Mhm.
But I think this discussion is really appropriate and helpful today. At this point, Jim, I think what we'll do is do what we normally do is open the mics and uh, give permission to people to ask questions. We and If you just want to if you look on the bottom of your screen, there are various things down there, but the react button is what you want to go to. And if you could use the raised hand function in there, and if you hit that raised hand function like I have, you'll see it come up. It pops up in the corner, and then I'll be able to recognize you if you have a question. So we can take those questions right now.
I did get a question in the email this week, actually.
Yes, go ahead.
A guy named Chris Barriger. And he raised an interesting question about game theory. He was a little skeptical of game theory, actually.
Yes.
And his skepticism went like this. It depends on knowing exactly what one individual's preferences and priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have a pretty clear idea of what those are. I want to do this. This is what I want. This is next. This is next. This is next.
Yeah.
Does altruism or empathy come into this at any point? Can it
Mm.
be that the person I'm in competition with, I might have some sympathy for them or some concern about them? Well, game theory doesn't really take that into account and doesn't really have a good way of dealing with that. And so he felt this is a real limitation of game theory. And basically, I think he's right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So game theory kind of presumes a basic selfishness
Right.
of each person.
But isn't that just like mathematics? We get an answer to one question under certain limited conditions. It gives us some
Mhm.
insights, but it
Mhm.
doesn't answer everything that
Right.
we
Right.
like.
Yeah. Mhm.
Dell, you've raised your hand. Go ahead, unmute and
Yeah, hey, John, thanks. And I really like the article, and I think it's a valuable way of approaching things, especially with the idea
Mhm.
that God interacts with us, emphasize interact, and he respects the choices we've made enough that his future interaction is going to be based on our choices, contrary to the theologians and so forth. But what struck me is in the illustration with Nineveh is that reading Jonah, the book linearly, Jonah was not delivering a message of repent or be destroyed. The Ninevans kind of repented, and then they more or less guessed something like the game theory matrix that you set up. God's mercifulness only comes in at the end of Jonah's excuse as to why he didn't go in the first place.
Mhm.
So what strikes me is when we're applying this, in a way, we're trying to figure out what God really wants, which is probably the value of the approach because it makes us really think about why we're making a decision.
Mhm.
But there's also a certain sense of we're kind of in the dark, that we don't necessarily have the same tactical choices that we think God is making when we're acting on. And that's kind of a comment, question, your thoughts about us acting in the dark and making up our own game as we go along.
Mm.
I got to admit, it's a little presumptuous of me to have said, here, I understand what God was thinking in the situation. But I did my best guess at what it looked like. But you're right. There's far more to God's thoughts than we can begin to understand, and what His preferences or priorities might be. God has revealed much of His purposes and mission in the world to us. So at least we can start with that.
It's interesting, Dell. Your question, the thought that comes to my mind is I'm thinking of Moses in Deuteronomy talking about how you teach your children. You teach them as you go by the way, as you walk along. Uh,
Mm.
it's very much an interactive, live,
Mm.
to and fro situation. It's all live performance at the moment. Um, it reminds me too is that what time do we have? in making these decisions. We look at that story of the Ninevites, right? And you say, well, if you read it linearly, well, what did they have? They only had moment by moment. We only have this moment. I have the past is instructive. I have the future I hope for, and then at the moment, and it does feel like, and I get Chris's discomfort with the math theory idea, right? It
Mhm.
feels restrictive, and
Mhm.
I hear it in what you're saying, Jim. Is you know God's not restricted by this, and that helps us to see that He isn't restricted. He could be working both tactics and strategy at the same time,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it I guess as you closing down or opening up opportunity. So,
Yeah, I guess if I could toss in, if I were given the 40 days and then destruction, I probably would have thought about where I could go visit for the next couple months away from there. But if I were, I hate to say this, if I had paid more attention to my economics courses, I might have begun wondering about the fallacy of the commons. If everybody else repents, maybe I don't have to, and it'll be good enough for God.
yep.
But again, I think the real value of the focus is why do we think God wants us to act this way? And
Mm,
where do we get those ideas why we think that? And that's why I really appreciate the article and the approach.
Mhm.
You did mention sociology, Jim, and I think it's psychology is the other one. It's the psychologists that picked up on this game
Right, right.
theory
Mhm.
and are working through all kinds of situations or trying to think through the choices that people make and why we make them, what motivates us, and trying to understand motivation is really deeply challenging. I know I had some discomfort when I just saw this 2 by 2 matrix. Is that all the choice we have? It's kind of like Mr. Johnson's question. I'm going to be either shot or hung in the morning, and you say, "Wait, isn't there a third choice out there? Something else?" But
See where I go with that, John, is remember, I'm a math modeler, right?
right.
Math modeling always simplifies everything. So we get comfortable with this, make all these assumptions, simplify things, leave that out, whatever makes for a good model.
Oh,
And sometimes it actually turns out to be helpful,
exactly, exactly. Well, Mike, I see Mike Byler is in there, and I was thinking Mike was going to jump in because he's done all I know about Mike's work. It's he can't tell me anything other than he does rapid or did rapid prototyping of weapons systems, and that was all he could tell me. Otherwise, he'd say he had to kill me. Uh, so, Mike, as we were talking about strategy and tactics, I was thinking of you. Does that resonate with your experience?
Yeah, it does. It would have been about 20 years ago. I was in the Middle East and we were putting together counter piracy plans.
Mm,
And we weren't using game theory per se, but we did have a list of our assets. We had a list of their assets and their tactics.
hmm
And we had to, well, maybe it is game theory. We had a game out, you know, if they use this, how would we react to that?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
I'm very familiar with that process.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because as Jim was describing it, uh, your conclusion, Jim, was not the one I thought was going to happen. I, I thought you were going to say that the U.S. made a mistake and there was something missing that wasn't even in the discussion. But so that was an interesting twist because it strikes me that this thing is very much like in computing science, the garbage in, garbage out.
Mhm.
The assumptions that you make,
Mhm.
you begin with, and how you set this
Mhm.
is really going to determine what your outcome is.
Right, right.
You want to say anything about that? I'm
Well, so this happened to be the example I chose, a good example where game theory actually worked,
yes,
where it really was helpful. And it's not always the case.
right.
Mhm.
Well, it doesn't always work. For instance, in economic theory,
Mhm.
I'm trying to recall back. I think it was Terry Morrison said to us years ago at one ASA member meeting, he was talking about chemistry. And he says that, the difference between biology and chemistry is that the molecules don't get up and walk off the lab bench. And when you add behavior, and Ralph's smiling, and I'm thinking rocks don't get up and move, right? Well, they move slowly on a certain time frame. It it really is how you frame these kinds of questions. Jim, have you done any? Have you had a conversation with any theologians on this kind of work over the years?
That's a good question. I don't think I have. Certainly on the question of randomness, we've had some of that, but that's a different question than talking about game theory.
Well, the reason that's interesting, well, we've got two hands up, so we'll go to those, and if we need to, we'll come back to that about theologians. So, Ralph, I see you're up first here. Go ahead.
What I wanted to bring up was something that both you and Dell already really kind of opened up, and that is that there's more than one individual involved here dealing with God, right? The Nineveh is an entity, but it's comprised of who knows how many thousands upon individuals, and so presumably those boxes have to include some sort of summation symbol in them, where you have a calculus of X number of individuals, and even in chapter 4, we find out that God's concerned about the animals too, right? He also is wanting to show mercy to the animals. So presumably there's some kind of calculus there where you're summing up a lot of different actors. In fact, we even note, Jim, in your next to the last paragraph, discerning what is optimal from God's point of view can be hard. Presumably he has all the knowledge needed to make that calculated decision. Then just to throw in one more question building on that, what do you do with Jesus' analogy of the shepherd who leaves the 99 and goes off to save the one straying sheep?
Well, presumably, the shepherd has left the 99 in some place where they're safe.
Well, we don't know that.
We don't know that for sure, but again, the story can't cover every detail, right?
No.
Yeah. And the same way, and your point is well taken about there being so many citizens there in Nineveh. There is a whole theory of multiplayer games, and it's but it is complex.
Was Nineveh the object of God's attention, or was it Jonah that he was interested in? Was he using Nineveh as a way to get to this critical prophet? And well, to extend that, it's a book in the Bible. Was it the rest of the world, the rest of us that are reading that story down through history? Maybe we were the object, and he's trying to change our minds by what he's doing.
So God's strategy is very broad.
All right, Arnie, go ahead.
I like your analogy to illustrate the idea of tactics. But I'm wondering how far we can carry that analogy when you have the American side and the Iraqi side. Of course, after the initial tactic is deployed, you have a response. And although the American side knows what alternatives they are, they don't know exactly what the choice on the Iraqi side will be. And I'm wondering if you apply that analogy now to God and myself. God is omniscient, but does he respect my free will to choose? And does he purposefully limit his knowledge of my choice in order to respect my free will? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Let me take a stab. I may not. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I guess I'd make a distinction between God knowing my choices and even what I'll do, and God controlling them. That is, God can know all my choices, but that doesn't mean God makes that choice for me or directs me to it. Is that moving in the right direction, Arnie?
Mm.
Yeah,
I
and
guess
that's
I'm of
where
the opinion that
strategy
God really does
comes
respect my free will. But yeah.
in. Right. Yeah. Uh, but we know that if he's omniscient, then he knows the consequences of every choice that we make. But does he know in advance what that choice will be? And each of those choices may conform to the strategy, but in terms of tactics and our free will, does he respect our choices in that sense that he limits his knowledge of what we will choose, and that allows him to change his tactics and change his feelings and his mind.
You gave some very difficult questions about God's relationship with time here, Arnie,
Yeah,
which are really
yeah,
hard. And I'm not going to presume to have an easy answer for them. Yeah,
yeah. It does imply that God
yeah,
experiences temporality just like we
yeah,
do.
yeah. Mm.
Mhm.
I familiar with open theology.
Yes,
Yeah. So there's one approach to it, saying that God simply
yeah,
doesn't know.
Mm.
yeah. Gregory
God's within
Boyd, or
time. There is not that they would say it does not violate God's omniscience because there's nothing there to be known.
yeah.
I'm not totally comfortable with that, but it
Hmm.
is an approach.
Well, Jim, there's another one that comes up to my mind in some other reading I've been doing, and that's the law-like nature of the universe.
Mm,
I'm curious about what you might think about um, how we talk about mathematics and the descriptions of the natural world. Um, some have said that math is the language of God. It's the language that God used to and uses to build and sustain the universe. Is that the way you would characterize it, or how would you characterize the place of this math you've been working with? Or maybe I should put it this way: how would you apply this mathematics theologically?
well, so I guess I'm of a point of view that mathematics is part of God's mind and is and always has been.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's the reason that it's so consistent and reliable. It's rooted in God's nature.
Mhm.
Um, do I want to say that math is the language of nature? My suspicion is that nature is much more complex and much more subtle than our mathematics. But
Mhm.
mathematics is a useful tool that God has made our minds and compatible enough with the way He's made the universe that we
Mhm.
can really use this tool effectively.
Mhm.
But I think it's always more complicated and more subtle than we think. Am I getting in the right direction, John?
Yeah, you are
Yeah.
absolutely, because there's a
Mhm.
series of these. Arnie, you raise this difficult questions, right?
Mhm, mhm,
How do we know? And I'm going at this question as does about randomness. I was reading some of those things. They were talking about that maybe mathematics and randomness existed apart from God in some way, and I just found that a very challenging kind of notion. You use the language of in the mind of God,
mhm, mhm,
which I feel more comfortable with.
mhm,
It it gets at these kind of imponderable questions, right? About what is the nature and character of God, and what's the nature and character of others, and in particular ideas. I think of mathematics uh, as less a tangible thing and more of an idea and a series of ideas that we have.
mhm,
Although I think you could argue that otherwise, but yeah, that's the direction I was headed with that question.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to respond. Um, there are some Christians who really do not think that we can say that mathematics exists in the mind of God. They
Hmm.
would say it's more of a human creation.
Hmm.
And they would go so far as to say that that's presuming too much knowledge on our part about the nature of God.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not altogether comfortable with that, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, I asked Jim earlier if he had interacted with a theologian. I don't know if there's anybody in the audience today that might want to comment on that, if you've had an experience that way. Jim, the reason I asked that is that it seems to me, we talked about this on the council and in numerous discussions in ASA, is that early in our history, 80 years ago, back in the 1940s, we had much, and 50s, and even through the 1960s, so the first 30 years of the ASA, we had a lot of interaction and conversation between theologians and ASA. Bernard Ram, of course, is a classic name that many will remember, but there were many others as well. In fact, at one point, ASA and the Evangelical Theological Society for a number of years would coordinate their annual meetings to be in the same town on the same days, and they would have an overlapping day. So intentionally building ways to do this interaction, because this isn't a problem just of science and theology. It's not an ASA problem, it's a bigger a problem of the academy, the specialization, the challenges of technical language. In my retirement, I've almost stopped reading science because I'm reading academic theology, and I've, for the last 10 years, just tried to understand that language, and it's jaw-breaking words and concepts that I admire theologians. I don't know how they do it sometimes. Science is easy compared to theology. I'll stick with biology, ecology, geology. Those are earth sciences. Then that's stuff that I can master. But I'm wondering if we have an opportunity here, through articles like this, through God and Nature, to try and cultivate that kind of conversation, because it feels like we're at a moment historically where conversation, being able to talk to one another, bringing people together on these kinds of questions, which are really challenging. But that's a moment that we have. And it's not just this one, but it's many other ones as well. So I just want to use this as an illustration. Anybody have any thoughts about that or experience with engaging theologians? Terry Gray has raised his hand. Terry? Do you have that or another question?
Mine was a different question.
Oh, can we just, well, let's just hold for a second. I'll come back to you, and I'll give anybody a chance that wants to chime in. Terry, it looks like I left them speechless. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your article and for being with us today, Jim. So I guess one thing that I see missing in the discussion of free will for what as part of this question is the distinction between a compatibilist free will and libertarian free will. And theologians have made that distinction that yes, we can have free will as creatures and not be forced sort of to do what we do, but it's under the sovereignty of God. God knows and even controls whatsoever comes to pass, as some of the confessions you use. And so there's this category of free will that I don't think gets mentioned often enough, that, we are free agents, but we are under, the divine decree, divine ordering, the divine sovereignty. And so, I guess what I was hearing in your language was only the distinction between, the libertarian free will idea that you don't seem to be wanting to go as far as some and say God doesn't know what the future is, but God doesn't determine. And that raises a related issue that I want to throw out and just get your reaction to. It seems that game theory is a creaturely category, and that if we yes, we can find scripture where there seems to be God seems to be making his decisions the way we make decisions. But it seems to me that somebody else commented earlier that because of God's omniscience and his transcendence and that he is really different from us. And we sometimes refer to the creature creator distinction. And that what I hear you doing is, making God a creaturely player just like us in some respects. And his decisions can be spelled out in a game theory creaturely description, just like ours. And I guess I wrestle with, whether that's consistent with scripture in terms of God's sovereignty and uniqueness and differentness and being outside of the creaturely category. Anyway, just wanted to maybe get your thoughts about that critique a little bit.
Well, at the risk of taking us in the wrong direction, let me give you what comes to my mind. So I've taught at a Calvinist school for quite a few years, but I've also been more influenced of late by some ideas that come from Thomas Aquinas. And again, I'm no Thomas theologian, but here's how I understand it. What Aquinas talks about the idea of God as the first cause, the primary cause of all things. I mean, he created everything and gave it the properties and the capability it has. Other things are secondary causes. But the interpretation in more contemporary language I've heard of this is that God gives everything, God its properties, but he also gives everything in his creation the capability of being a causative agent in its own right, which means that God does not directly control whatever happens. God really gives genuine freedom, even to the level of molecules. It doesn't mean that God's not involved or sustaining or involved in his creation, but there's genuine, authentic freedom at every different level, so that creation is truly other than God, and he interacts with it in that way. And so that's where that's kind of the direction I go in its response of libertarian versus concordist. I think that's the right word. Free will. I'm much more inclined to say no. It's for libertarian, and that's where I'm coming from.
Kirk, I see you've raised your hand. You have a follow-up question or
Yeah, just kind of following up on what Terry said. For those of us who believe in God's omniscience and don't accept open theism, God knows ahead of time which choice we're going to make in this game theory. So does that affect the matrix or the construction and description of this at all?
Yeah, I think the issue is control. I mean, God can know but not control. To me, that's where I go with it.
Yeah, and I would agree.
Terry,
See, I just to throw in, I would say that even if God controls, that doesn't mean that we aren't legitimate agents. So that and that's the different line that a compatibilist free will advocate would make. That's different from the distinction you're making.
Okay.
So as you're talking, Terry, and thanks for that question and your comment there, because I'm reminded of this is about creatureliness, and creatureliness and creator. What's that relationship between us? And I'm reminded of Donald Mackay's way back in 1964 or something like that. He wrote a little book on a clockwork image.
I remember it.
And I think it gets the questions he was dealing with gets right at this. I see several people nodding. This is a long-standing kind of issue for us, and an important one. The nature of, who are we and who is God, and how does He act, and how do we interact? Some of the stuff I've been reading. I was preaching here a couple of weeks ago on Psalm 19. And the metaphor there in Psalm 19 splits between the book of nature, of creation, and the law of God. And so you have law on one hand, and I'm thinking mathematics here. Mm-hmm. It's law-like, although not particularly elaborated in Scripture. We think of the law of God, you don't immediately think mathematics, but I think that's close. And then the book. But the metaphor is the book, and that metaphor dominates right up through 1600. And then there's an interesting shift, and we move to a metaphor of a clock, a mechanistic structure, where a clock is nature has this clockwise, and we've run that metaphor for a long time, and it feels to me like it's failing us. Is that because it's not clock-like, as you guys have been describing here, right? We don't run like a clock. As I said, the molecules, Terry Morris has said, molecules don't get up and walk off the bench, but animals do. They have behavior, they have agency. And that whole question of mind and agency has really come to the forefront in our thinking and how we describe ourselves then, not just as humans, but as all creatures. What is that? What is the nature of a creature? And so I got into some discussions with Randy Isaac about this. We had about a 6 month or a year-long discussion about the nature of creatureliness and what it is. And I think that's a rich area that we could see opened up even more. Well, if there are other comments here, if not, I'm going to try and draw this together. Jim, this has been so helpful today.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I want to thank you. Do you have any final things you want to say to us?
Well, again, I probably would open too much of a longer conversation here. One of the things I want to call attention to is the implications of this game theory idea for how we understand Scripture. The idea of God as the optimal decision maker, distinction between strategy and tactics, is that just because God dealt with a certain way with a particular people in history, I use the example in the paper about how the role of women in church office. Mm-hmm. And Paul says some very definite things about that, and that which were probably optimal at that time. It doesn't make them optimal today from God's point of view. Mm-hmm. We have to it seems to me, we understand Scripture as God's dealing with real people in a real situation. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand more deeply God's purposes and not just automatically take what was appropriate for that situation at that time and try to apply it in our time. Anyway, enough said.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jim. I think that's a great way to summarize this and pull this together. This has been really helpful. I mean, the article and this discussion has been really stimulating for me. I know the kinds of things that I'm struggling with and working with and trying to understand. Academic theologians is just about as difficult as it is trying to understand mathematicians when they talk technically. And yet that's what we're here for in the ASA, is to bring those two conversations together, and we try to do that. And next month, we're going to move the conversation forward in another way. Let me just let you know that we will have a special guest with us, a non-ASA member, James Costa. Jim is an evolutionary biologist. He's an entomologist, which means dear to my heart. I am an entomologist technically by training and, impulse too. But he's a specialist on Darwin and on Wallace and their interaction. And he's at Western Carolina University, but he's also traveled, does field station work, and has traveled throughout the tropics. In fact, we were going to have him in here last month, and he was in the tropics, and so we'll have him coming to us in the second week of July to discuss his book, Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. If you've read on Alexander von Humboldt's stories, or you've read Darwin's journey, if you read any of these 19th century naturalists, Henry Bates and others, you'll really like this book. It is a bit of a page turner. It's every few pages I'm stopping to mark up things and make notes, because it's really a fascinating book for certainly for an entomologist, evolutionary ecologist. And Sarah Tolzman has reviewed that book in Perspectives, and you might want to read that review and be ready as we have that conversation as our next one. And then, of course, I need to mention we have the ASA meeting coming up. You can, if you're going to be there in person, Kathy and I will be there, and Dana will be there at the registration desk, and we'll be smiling with at least the first few days, and we'll try and smile right through the whole meeting. And be sure you stop by and say hello, invite your friends. If you cannot make it to Denver, and I think Terry Gray is going to be there, and I know Lynn Billman just sent out a message to a few of us this morning. They're organizing some hikes for Tuesday morning in the local area. So lots of different things going on there. But if you can't be there in person, then you can be there online. And be sure you sign up and get online, and you're going to be stimulated, I know. So great to see you all. God bless you on the rest of this Saturday and on your worship together in your community tomorrow. And we'll see you all next week on Diving Deeper Discussions.